Welcome to our introductory lecture on Plato's Apology of Socrates. What I want to do here in this lecture is to give a brief introduction to Plato's arguably most famous work, his Apology of Socrates. I know many of you have read this, and what I want to do is focus on some of the more hidden passages or some of the more subtle nuances of the argument that you might not have caught your first time reading it through. Okay, so let's start off by breaking down the title. It's entitled Plato's Apology of Socrates. The word apology here is not used the way that we normally think and use the word apology. In our modern context, the word apology is used to say that you're sorry for something. So you get in trouble, and we're taught that we should apologize or tell someone that we're sorry. The word here actually comes from the Greek word apologia, which means a reasoned defense. Socrates, in this dialogue, is given his own defense, a defense of his way of life, a defense against the charges that are brought against him. So that's real important to know if we're going to understand the teaching of this dialogue, that the point is not for Socrates to say that he's sorry for anything, but it's really to give a reasoned defense of his way of life, and really to give a defense of the activity of philosophy itself. Okay. We should also note that the trial of Socrates took place in 399 BC. 399 BC, so roughly 400 years before the time of Christ. It's interesting that we're still reading this dialogue some 2,400 years later. Ultimately, as many of you know, Socrates was convicted, and ultimately he was executed by the city of Athens for the two charges that were brought against him: corrupting the youth of Athens and not believing in the gods of the city. And we'll talk more about those charges here in a few minutes. The jury that convicted Socrates consisted of 501 members. So a much larger jury than what we're familiar with. We might be familiar with a 11 or 12 person jury. The Greeks obviously took this pretty seriously because they put 501 people on this jury. And that was the common practice for the time, to have very large juries where the members were chosen by lot. So it was actually a chance drawing that a person would serve on one of these juries. Socrates was convicted by a vote of 281 to 220. It was a relatively close vote, we could say, but ultimately it led to his doom. Okay. Next, briefly, what we're reading here is a Platonic dialogue. Socrates himself never wrote anything down. Everything that we know about Socrates comes from his students. Socrates' most famous student was Plato. Okay, and we're reading here Plato's account of Socrates' defense of his way of life. And if you read closely, you might have noticed the name Plato appears in this dialogue. And it's interesting to note that this is the only time where Plato ever mentions himself in any of his dialogues. And he authored some 35 different dialogues, most of which have Socrates as the main person in that dialogue. A dialogue, we can say, is a dramatic conversation between two or more people. And as a reader, we really get to participate in the dialogue. And I like to tell my students that it's best to actually picture yourself and to imagine that you're sitting on that jury. and that you're listening to Socrates' defense and you're listening to the charges that were brought against him. And to ask yourself, how would you have voted? Right? Does Socrates really defend himself well to the point where you would ultimately acquit him of the charges? So, what we have here is probably, as I said before, Plato's most famous dialogue, his Apology of Socrates, where he recounts the historical events that took place at the trial of Socrates. Okay, let's look at some of the basic themes of the Apology. The Apology shows the crisis of philosophy. Up until this time, philosophy was a relatively new activity. It hadn't been around that long. There were some philosophers who were known as pre-Socratics, philosophers that came before Socrates. But it was really with Socrates that philosophy became transformed and started inquiring into issues like morality and justice and questions about the human good and what is the best way of life. Prior to Socrates, the philosophers who are known as the pre-Socratics, their primary interest was in what we would think of as natural science. They were looking for a natural reason to explain the universe, or a natural cause that would explain why there is something rather than nothing. However, philosophy began to take a different shape with Socrates. Philosophy really became something new. It turned from questions of natural science to questions of morality, questions of justice and goodness. And at this point in time, the legacy of philosophy and the future of philosophy was really in jeopardy. And the Apology shows that crisis. It really shows the conflict between the city of Athens, political life itself, and the philosophical way of life represented by Socrates. The Apology also shows the justification of philosophy before the city of Athens. Socrates here is really brought to trial to give an account of his way of life, or to justify his way of life, to give a reasoned defense of it before the city of Athens. But we can also read the Apology as the defense of the city before philosophy. So it's not just philosophy that's being brought here to give an account of itself. The city of Athens, and the political leaders of that city, they are also called to account for bringing Socrates to trial. And as you know from reading the dialogue, Socrates engages in a cross-examination of Meletus and Anytus, two of the prominent political leaders of Athens. So the city itself and political life is also to give an account of itself before philosophy. One of the major themes that the Apology highlights is the tension between philosophy and the city and philosophy and poetry. And what the Greeks understood by poetry is not so much the literature that we understand by poetry. I mean, when we think of poetry, we commonly think of literature. For the Greeks, poetry was directly connected to religion. And the great Greek religious myths were myths that were given in poetic form. So one can think of Homer, for example, as the greatest Greek poet. And the Greeks would look to Homer for information about the gods, for information about what the gods demand of human beings. And the Apology brings out that tension, maybe more so than any other Platonic dialogue, that tension between philosophy and poetry.